So what we found was that regardless of the THC content in the cigarette, the participants achieved similar levels of impairment, of highness, and blood THC concentrations. So they modified the way they smoked such that those who had twice the exposure potentially to THC in the 13.4 group had no greater THC concentrations than those in the 5.9% group.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guests, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. In this episode, we deviate slightly from our usual format to feature an interview with Dr. Tom Marcotte, co-director of the CMCR, where we delve into his research on cannabis use and driving impairment. I'm Dr. Jamie Caroon. I am a project scientist at the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. I'm here with Dr. Tom Marcotte, co-director of the CMCR. Dr. Marcotte, my understanding is that you recently completed a large study looking at the acute effects of dried cannabis flower on driving impairment. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this was the largest randomized double-blind clinical trial looking at the administration of cannabis or placebo on driving performance. It was published a year ago in JAMA Psychiatry. For this study, we took 191 cannabis users, so by far the largest study, and randomized them to either get a placebo, 5.9 or 13.4% THC content joint or cigarette. And then we had them complete a driving simulator, smoke, and then follow driving simulator performance over the next 4 hours. A number of interesting results came out of this. So this was a federally approved clinical trial. We went through all of the necessary regulations, getting approvals from the Food and Drug Administration, Drug Enforcement Agency, IRBs, et cetera. And working through our investigational pharmacy, we're able to distribute these products and have individuals smoke here at our CMCR lab and then follow their performance.
So how difficult is it to administer cannabis to a research participant in a clinical trial here in the U.S.?
There are a number of steps that one has to go through. In our experience now over decades of doing this research, it can take a year to a year and a half to get all the federal regulatory approvals as well as the institutional approvals. We are limited if we're going to do a randomized clinical trial where we're actually administering product to individuals. The Food and Drug Administration needs to review those products and determine whether or not they're safe to administer to humans, and also review the protocols. That can take a while, as can getting DEA approvals. It's certainly able to be done, and we've done a number of controlled clinical trials with cannabis, but it limits what products you can use and limits sort of the research designs you can employ.
So who funded this study?
This study was funded by the state of California when the state passed Proposition 64, which allowed recreational or adult use of cannabis for those over 21. A set of legislators were particularly concerned about the public safety impact of that legalization. So they sponsored a bill, and this was primarily led by Assemblyman Tom Lackey, who's a retired CHP officer, a bill for us to design and implement a study that would look at the acute effects of cannabis on both driving performance, then ultimately also looking at how well officers can detect impairment due to use.
So you mentioned there were 2 different potencies of cannabis flower and then a placebo. What did you find?
So what we found was that regardless of the THC content in the cigarette, the participants achieved similar levels of impairment, of highness, and blood THC concentrations. So they modified the way they smoked such that those who had twice the exposure potentially to THC in the 13.4 group had no greater THC concentrations than those in the 5.9% group. So much like one might use alcohol and use a strong liquor versus wine, people will modify how they use that so they don't become least in many cases, overly intoxicated.
This is interesting. There's a lot of concern about the increasing percent of THC in available cannabis and cannabis products today. But what you're saying is that you saw a tendency for research participants to titrate the amount that they use, such that if they were using a product that maybe had less THC, they might use more of it. And if they were using a product that had more THC, relatively speaking, they might use less of it.
That's correct. And actually, it's even more nuanced than that, because both the groups smoked the same amount. Well, when you look at the weight that was returned in that cigarette, they were roughly the same. So they used the same amount of product, but the way they used it in terms of inhalation, holding it in, et cetera, modified how much THC got into their system. We went up to 13.4. Now we have a study looking at 18%. Certainly in dispensaries, people talk between 20 and 30%. If it holds true, certainly that is what I would expect, would be that even these higher THC concentrations do not necessarily make people more impaired unless they're actually seeking that out. What we don't know very well are the impacts of these high THC concentrates, things such as dabbing wax or vaping, and how well people do or do not self-titrate when using those methods of administration.
So can you explain again the sequence of smoking and using the driving simulator, and then tell us about some of the outcomes that were used to assess driving impairment?
Sure. So people entered the study and we would bring them in and they would do a half a day of training on the simulator. So it felt very comfortable to them, felt like a real world drive, even though obviously it's not. Then they would come on the experimental day. We do the driving simulations. They would go into our negative pressure room here at the CMCR. They would smoke the cannabis product that we received from the NIDA drug supply program. And then we would follow them for the next 4.5 hours on repeated driving simulation challenges, as well as other outcomes. A number of interesting findings came from this study. First of all, not everyone became significantly impaired when they inhaled cannabis. So based upon how the placebo group did, we estimated that about 45% of the people in the THC group would be called impaired on the driving simulator. So about half had significant decline in performance, half did not. We also found that the time course for impairment was somewhat time limited. So people would usually start showing recovery in driving performance at about 3.5 hours and be completely back to baseline by 4.5 hours. One of the important findings that came out from this study was that at 30 and 90 minutes, the groups were performing equally poorly on the driving simulator. But even those individuals who were inclined not to drive at 30 minutes felt safer to drive at 90 minutes and said they were more likely to go out on the road. So they were perceiving that they were starting to recover from the effects of THC, when in fact, in the driving simulator, we were seeing no improvement yet. So that's a particularly concerning time in this 1.5-hour, 2-hour period, where people, even with the best of intentions, who do not plan on driving while high, may not be the most accurate judges of whether or not they're safe to drive.
And what about the participants in the placebo group?
So participants in the placebo group, that was interesting. One of the advantages of doing a double-blind study is that you can give people placebo and see whether or not that affects their performance. In fact, the placebo group did just fine. They did not show a decline in performance. It was very stable over the 5 hours. But half of the people in the placebo group thought they got the real thing. They may not think the CMCR gives them very good cannabis, but they thought they had the real thing. So they reported slightly elevated levels of highness and so forth. So when we asked the individuals whether or not they were feeling high and the drug might be affecting their driving performance, across all time points, the THC group said it was affecting their driving performance more so than the placebo group. But when we asked, how well did you drive? The only time point where the THC group reported driving less well than the placebo group was that 30-minute point. At every other point, they reported it being about the same level as the placebo group.
So what is the takeaway here for maybe law enforcement? Is there any value that they can glean from the results of this study?
Well, there are a number of pieces of information that came out of this, one of which we haven't discussed yet, and that was the relationship or lack thereof of blood concentrations in THC and driving performance. So this replicates, but at a much higher scale, the fact that you really cannot look at blood THC concentrations and infer any level of impairment. Unlike alcohol, where there's a fairly clear linear relationship between blood alcohol concentrations and driving performance or impairment. With THC, it's very different. The pharmacokinetics and dynamics mean that the blood THC concentrations drop very rapidly after use, and there is just no correlation there. It is also informative for law enforcement that, yes, we can see people who maybe think they're not impaired, but may well be impaired.
So these participants were cannabis users, correct? And do you think that tolerance plays a role here?
Very much so, at least in terms of the amount of THC people got into their system. So we looked at the amount of THC exposure over the last 6 months to sort of divide people in those who were the most frequent users and the heaviest users, those who were lighter users. And what we found was that those people who were the most frequent users got very high, significantly higher THC concentrations in their blood and did no worse on the driving simulator than those people who had lower concentrations. So there was clear behavioral tolerance there in the regular users. However, they also did no better. So when people were told to go ahead and achieve the level of highness you desire, they ended up at the same performance level as those who had less THC in their system. So there was behavioral tolerance, but they offset this by getting more THC into their body.
So this phenomenon you're describing where blood levels do not correlate with performance, I know there's been a strong desire to have an objective measure that could be administered at the roadside from a law enforcement perspective. And it sounds like that is going to be very challenging and that maybe field sobriety tests are what officers are going to have to rely upon?
Certainly, that's one component of what they look at. They look at the driving behavior, what they call the vehicle in motion. They'll look at interviews. They'll look at the driver getting out of the car and fumbling or not, and also incorporate these field sobriety tests. Increasingly, there's a lot of interest in oral fluid testing because this can be done at roadside where you can take a swab, run it in a person's mouth and get sort of instant feedback as to whether or not there are any indications of THC in their system or at least in their oral cavity. One of the challenges with that is, although it tends to show more recent use, it's still not necessarily very recent use. So these oral swabs can end up THC positive for 8, 12, 20 hours after a person is used. And so you can't necessarily infer that, oh, this was a recent use. So if you're seeing impairment, it must be due to cannabis.
You talked a little bit about pharmacokinetics, and this study used inhaled or smoked dried cannabis flower. Do you have plans to look at other types of cannabis products like ingestible products, and what might you expect to find with the different pharmacokinetic profile?
So certainly on our wish list is to look increasingly at real world products. This includes gummies and other liquids and drinks and so forth. But because of the scheduling of cannabis as well as prohibitions kind of from the FDA, since these products are not really made to a high enough grade to be part of a clinical trial, we're really not able to do that in a standard fashion like we did in the smoked cannabis study. The other really strong area of interest are these high THC concentrates. So these are waxes or oils that have, say, 90% THC in them. And there's a lot of concern about both the cognitive effects, the driving effects, and maybe even psychiatric effects of using those products. The way we will try to look at those is to make accommodations to the design of the study and treat it as an observational study. So for this study, which we're calling the Real World Cannabis Study, we are having participants vape or dab in their own home and then come out to a specially modified Sprinter van that has been set up with a full-size simulator inside it, has laboratory facilities and actually facilities to test cognition as well, and try to replicate what we did in a very controlled setting here at the center with a smoke study out in the field. It's one way to try to sort of make accommodations for federal legalities and so forth and make sure that we can do this research without violating any regulations.
So this sounds pretty innovative. You're effectively studying people who are using whatever cannabis product they normally use in their homes?
Correct. So we will have them go ahead and purchase their typical product. It will need to be from a licensed dispensary so that we have some confidence in the certificate of analysis and what's in that product, as well as some confidence in the safety. But either way, it's what they normally use. We're not assigning it to them. And then they will go into their home. We'll use video to sort of confirm that they're using the product as they say. They'll do weighing of it so we can see pre and post weight and see how that does or doesn't relate to THC concentrations in blood. And then they'll come back out to our van and do the driving simulations. We will also be doing our own confirmation of what's in the product because, as you know, there's a lot of controversy sometimes over what's in even some of the dispensary-based products. So we will have a third-party laboratory sort of neutralize or make the concentrate unusable and then evaluate it for THC concentrations and other factors. So we'll have a sort of independent validation or not of the certificate of analysis that this grower or manufacturer provided.
Right. So the driving simulator will be installed inside the van itself.
Correct. It's all set up. It looks slightly different, but we set up all the parameters, the distances, the drives, the look and feel of the drive to be very similar to what we do in our laboratory setting.
So will rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, if it happens, will it allow researchers to use real-world cannabis products so you don't have to configure this study to use a van and track people in that way?
Unfortunately, the actual results or outcomes from rescheduling are not clear. So one thing that is clear is if we want to do a clinical trial, we really need to have products that are manufactured to a certain level of quality that meets FDA requirements. Currently, it's probably unlikely that dispensary-based products meet those requirements. Now, going to Schedule 3 may open up opportunities for other companies that want to manufacture products according to what we call good manufacturing practices, that perhaps there would be more products that mirror real-world products available for clinical trials.
So for this upcoming real-world cannabis study, what type of participants are you looking to enroll?
So as with our initial study, we really want a broad spectrum from the community. This will be a community outreach effort. People will have to be willing to do about a day and a half of testing. One day will, of course, be at their home. And be willing to abstain from using cannabis for a couple of days before both the training and the experimental day session. But really, we're looking for broad age ranges, at least up to age 55. And we exclude sort of relatively older adults because we don't want confounds of additional medications and all of that. So geographically, we're looking for people who are within a reasonable driving distance of our center here. So probably generally in San Diego County would work out just fine.
So they'll have to come to a UCSD facility for the screening and enrollment, but the study itself will happen in their home and in the simulator outside of their home?
That is correct. So the first day they would come to our center here. We'd probably do the training just in the parking lot and get them acclimated to the driving simulator. But the actual testing day, we would go to their home, provide them with a meal for lunch and so forth. And as you'll see in the van, it's laid out fairly well to try to be a comfortable setting for a full day of testing.
So should we go outside and take a look at the van?
Let's do that.
All right.
So this is our driving simulator. This is pretty much the same setup we used for the smoked cannabis study in the laboratory setting at our center. We've mirrored both the challenges that people encounter, the design of the monitors and so forth, so that we can ultimately compare how people do under the influence of perhaps dabbing or vaping compared to smoked cannabis, as well as looking at healthy controls who are not using any substances. These driving simulators include a number of challenges. Coming up, we'll be merging onto a freeway, avoiding crashes, and so forth. We specially outfitted this van so that it works on solar power and can operate without running the engine nonstop during the course of the day. So that operates air conditioning as well as the computers and other instruments such as the refrigerators. So it's completely self-contained for a full day of evaluations.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms. Or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.